Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome to our first Vanta Ask Me Almost Anything webinar. We're covering a pretty broad topic today of all things security and compliance. And as we continue this series, we'll start to get a bit more granular. But we thought this would be a really great foundation and jumping off point for us to get this series started. So I'll do some quick introductions in just a few moments, but just kind of want to go over the run of show with everybody here today. We'll do some introductions so you can get to know me and our expert, Matt Cooper. We have a list of questions that we had received from people attending the webinar that we'll go through first. And then towards the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session, we'll do an open Q&A. So if you have questions, if things come to you, feel free to drop them directly into the chat. We'll make sure we are taking track of those, answering them later in the session. And if you have a question related to something that we are talking about currently, feel free to drop that in and I will do my best to incorporate those as they come through. So welcome everybody. Keep your chat box open. We are really excited to be here with you today. So I'm gonna close this screen out and we can introduce myself and Matt Cooper. So it looks like my video is giving me a hard time, but I'm still going to introduce our wonderful subject matter expert here, which is Matt Cooper. So my name is Shannon. I run the education program here at Vanta, and this is Matt Cooper. Do you want to give a little bit of information about yourself before we get started?
Hey, Shannon. Great to be here. Hey, folks. My name is Matt Cooper, Senior Manager for Privacy, Risk, and Compliance at Vanta. I've spent my 20-plus year career in IT and security in various forms and facets. And for almost the last decade, I was consulting in cybersecurity and data privacy readiness. So working on things like ISO 27001 readiness, SOC 2, HIPAA, and then also I worked as a data protection officer for customers, helping them with GDPR, CCPA, things like that. So I'm really looking forward to the session. I will answer almost any question that you ask to the best of my ability, and let's get started.
Excellent. All right. Well, I tried to figure out my video settings, which are giving me some trouble. We'll jump in with our first question, which we actually get pretty regularly. I hear this from the support team a lot. So our first question is, do I need to monitor my contractors' computers?
Great question. I'm going to give you a clear answer, which is it depends. All right, let me break that down. So not all contractors are created equal. So let's try to think of, some sort of principle to, assess this by. One great standard to use is if a contractor is doing equivalent work and has equivalent access as an employee, and you have certain controls imposed on the employee, why would you not have those same controls imposed on the contractor? So that's one sort of level of litmus test. So if you have a contractor that is a senior developer that's pushing code into your environment, I absolutely want you to have some control over their laptop. That may not mean you need to literally monitor it. There may be other ways to achieve that. Say, for example, you spot check their device if you can't, literally monitor it, or you have, contractual obligations on the things that they're going to do, or maybe you've set some sort of conditional access on the, on their ability to attach to your infrastructure so that, there's some sort of technical checks on whether their device meets a certain level or standard. But it can't be, or it shouldn't be that, they're contractors. So I don't know, there's nothing we can do. If they won't put something on their device because it's their device, maybe you need to give them a corporate device if that's their level of sensitivity. Now, there's other contractors who don't have that level of sensitive access. Maybe, they're doing something else in your organization. Maybe they're not even touching production data. Maybe they're writing code, but then they're submitting it and your, employee team is actually checking it, verifying it, deploying it, et cetera. then you could potentially, put a lower standard on what you expect for their device. At the end of the day, this is a risk-based decision that your organization needs to make. You should have like a framework or a justification for why you're making these decisions. And yeah, that's generally how I think about it.
Excellent. That is incredibly helpful. Thank you. All right. Well, we got one of many down. So let's just move on to the second question here. So somebody had asked, do you have any guidance on how to develop a risk management strategy that makes sense for my organization's needs?
Risk management is a complex and potentially difficult topic. So let's taking this question, let's just assume that you're kind of starting from square one. Maybe this is the first time that you're doing a risk assessment and you need a basic strategy. So one thing you could do is do a little bit of self-education. Look at some of the documents and references that are normative in the industry. So a couple of things I might point to would be ISO 27005, which is a risk management framework. NIST also has a risk management framework. It's much longer and more dense, but extremely helpful. And do a little bit of reading on, what's involved in risk management. When you want to go and get started, I have a couple just practical tips for you. First off, think about who are you going to involve, right? So I would definitely involve, a cross section of the organization, senior leadership from the various functions that you have, as well as, senior technical folks. And you can take a very sort of pragmatic approach to it. So when we were doing consulting, when I used to work at BSI, we did risk management. Let me talk about some of the methodologies that we would use there. We would go into an interview as a consultant, and we're new to the company. We don't really, know deeply like the environment. We would simply ask first off, what's your role and function? What are you responsible for? What technologies do you use in your day-to-day job? Like what software applications and hardware, et cetera, do you use? And then you could start at a sort of a high level of like, hey, in your job function, when you think about information security, what concerns you? What is the company not doing well? What keeps you up at night? And just kind of start from that, broad brush point of view. And just write those things down in plain language without worrying about, like the formalities of risk assessment, just to give yourself, a general starting point for, how to approach it. You can then okay, that's one place. You could then take a framework, like ISO is a great starting point, where they have like a number of different controls that are applicable to different, verticals in the organization. So like HR controls, some technical controls, et cetera. And you could essentially work backwards from those and say, hey, are you applying these controls? So let's say like access management, maybe you're in the sales function and, Salesforce is one of your tools. You could say, hey, who controls access for Salesforce? Who has privileged rights here? What's the process to provision and deprovision that access? Now, if they say, oh, that's controlled by our, enterprise engineering team, everything's, role-based access, and we, have a onboarding and offboarding checklist, and, everything's deprovisioned like immediately at the time of termination. And when you do an access review every quarter, sounds pretty good. If they say, oh, well, the junior admin on the sales team, she just adds people whatever rights they need. And when new people join, we usually just say, hey, your job's, Jill's job similar to Bob's job. So let's just give Jill Bob's access. And then we'll just keep doing that forever and just clone people's access. That sounds potentially like you may have some risks there. You may have some, overly privileged access, stuff like that. So you then may have a risk on access on that particular system. you can go through that whole exercise. You'll come up with a bunch of different risks. What ISO generally wants you to do, and I think this is a good sort of common methodology, is you say, okay, based on this risk, how impactful would it be if this bad thing happened? And so that's one ranking. And then it's how likely is that thing to happen? And then based on how bad is it and how likely is it, that gives you your risk ranking. That's essentially how you go through and you organize all these risks, and then you try to, filter them by those which have the highest risk ranking. Now, sort of last step is you say, okay, well, I have like 35 things on here. Can I like bucket these into categories, or can I really like elevate what are the top ones? Some things are maybe little nits specific to a certain system. Some things are maybe more systemic, organizational wide, and try to filter into a list of, I would say, roughly 5 to 15 important risks, because at the end of the day, the risk management exercise should help to inform senior leaders on making strategic decisions for the organization. And if you have 45 things, that's just like too much detail to make strategic decisions. So you want kind of a manageable number of things that are important for the organization that are going to drive decision making. So I know I'm just scratching the surface here. That's hopefully a helpful comment. But there's a lot to it, and ask me a follow-up question if that was your question.
That was great. I think you really scratched the surface, as you mentioned, of a really complex topic. But one thing that you did highlight on was bringing in multiple viewpoints when performing a risk assessment. And I think that that's something that's incredibly important. That's often overlooked. So yeah, I love that you.
I want to follow up to that. I want to follow up on your comment, Shannon.
Please do.
When you're talking to teams, I said use like, hey, get the leaders, right? That's important. But it also is sometimes important to go one level below the leaders, because often the leaders, when they hear the question, they kind of, know the right answer intuitively, and maybe they're like skilled politicians. So if you talk to your CTO, he has a point of view. But then if you talk to like someone in engineering or DevOps or someone in the weeds that maybe doesn't have that concern for giving the right answer, you might get a little level of detail, that you didn't get at the top. So strike a balance between who you talk to. That's my point.
Excellent. Well, we actually just got a really great question coming into the chat. So I'm going to bump this one up to the top so we can answer it next. So one of our guests asked, we have a problem with the fact that most clients are not willing to go through the documents in the trust report. And for that reason, they prefer their policy templates, SLAs, and so on. Does there exist a list of the most critical questions the enterprises need to know from the perspective of cybersecurity compliance? And I can put that into the chat as well. I know it was a long one, so if folks want to take a second to read it, please feel free to do so. And Matt, I'll send this to you as well.
I don't know that I fully understand the question, so I would encourage this person to, maybe do a follow-up. I'm going to try to do my best answer that I can. Is there a list of the most critical questions enterprises need to know? No, there's not. There's not like a short, list. That being said, you could definitely Google, hey, what are the most, critical security controls? And you're going to get, 20 different blogs on that. There are certainly certain domains that I would say are the most important. I'll just go top of my head and say, access management, encryption, vulnerability management and configuration management from a technical standpoint. And probably last would be like SDLC security. So development security, those are a bunch of critical buckets. Vendor security is a critical bucket. Another thing I would think about, though, as I'm talking to myself, look at the industry standards. So, we have things like ISO and SOC 2, but actually a very helpful security standard is put up by the Center for Internet Security, that's CIS. and it's called the CIS Critical Security Controls. And it's a pretty detailed list of controls. And one of the things that they do is they rank them by maturity into what they call implementation groups. And so they say, hey, around asset management, like this is what you should do. It's pretty prescriptive and detailed. Asset management also is another important control. And at this level of maturity, you should do like these 3 things. And if you're doing those things, then you could add, these 2 things, but these are more like nice to haves, more advanced, more mature controls. And they do that, throughout the different domains. I would actually think that's an excellent, industry standard reference to help you get a foothold on, what are the most critical security controls. That's why they call it that, the CIS critical security controls. That would be a terrific reference.
That's great. And I have to do a shameless plug for Vanta here as well. I know you said your customers are having trouble accessing all of the documents and the trust reports, or they just, weren't willing to do so. But if I'm understanding your question correctly, and with Cooper's great explanation, one of the other features you could hopefully try and point them to is the FAQs section in your trust report, where you can kind of compile the questions and answers that Cooper kind of just mentioned, and provide them in a very clean template on the trust report. So if they didn't want to go through all the documents, you could at least kind of give them that information from the trust report there. Again, I could be totally missing the question myself. I am definitely not this me, but had to bring that up because I'm a big fan of trust reports myself.
Great point, Shannon.
Excellent. All right, so we got some more questions coming in, so I'm going to keep rolling with these. Thank you all for asking your questions and participating with us today. So we have a question here. What are some triggering events for organizations to consider pursuing both ISO 27001 and SOC 2? And what benefits can they expect beyond cost savings from crossover testing if they already have one of those certifications?
Okay, great question. So there's various drivers. I'll give you the easy one. Your customers are asking for this, and you can't do deals until you do it. So that can come in the form of a hard requirement, and it can come in the form of a soft requirement. So if you're doing deals with certain enterprises or trying to, banks, let's say, right? They may have a hard requirement that, hey, vendors, vendor risk is hard. We can't spend like millions and millions of dollars assessing every vendor individually. Like that's super painful for us. You have to have an ISO or SOC 2. That is the baseline. That's table stakes, right? If that's the case for you, then you have to do it. That's a good sign that you should go and do it. Government's another example. You sell to university systems in Texas, and you have to have TextRAMP. Like that's just a hard requirement. Now there could be like a soft requirement, meaning you're selling to folks that have security sophistication, and they strongly prefer that you have an ISO or SOC 2. It's not a hard requirement, but your process to onboard with them is extremely painful and time consuming. And you really want to save, the effort of your engineering team. Doing something like an ISO and SOC 2 is going to give the customer greater assurance because it means you had a third-party audit of your program, and it's not just you, testifying to the controls that you're doing. So that's, another great reason to do it. I'll stop there. There are some other reasons, but I think those are actually like the most common.
All right, so we have another one coming through. This is a great question, and I know that all of our customer success managers get questions like this a lot, so I'm sure they'll be very excited to hear you answer this, Matt. What's the easiest way to customize, trim down our policy template while making sure the policy is compliant?
Okay, a couple different options here. So let me just kind of frame this in the context of, what's the point of policies, and how do they work? So policies are expressing the will of management, and they're setting the control environment for your organization. And so functionally, ISO articulates this. there's a relationship between potentially the level of detail in your policy and the size of your organization. So meaning, if you're a 10-person startup and the co-founder, you are the CTO, you are doing coding and checking, you're very hands-on, you can get away with lighter weight, simpler policies because you are very hands-on in the control environment and you're communicating with your team, et cetera, and so you only need policies to be functional, for your organization. Let's go to the flip side. If you're a massive global enterprise like Boeing or Microsoft, management's way up here and the control implementers are down here. So for those policies and procedures to function, they need a significant level of detail that just to operate successfully. Because there's no way management's not talking to, say, the control owners. So now you have a separate question of, okay, well, what about requirements? And here you have to look at what are your objectives here? You're going to have requirements from like a security framework that you're doing, like ISO or SOC 2 or NIST, or you're going to have requirements from your customers and what they expect. And so the policies need to support your organization meeting the requirements that are relevant for your organization. So you need at least that. And then, the last thing I'd say here would be, as for the level of detail, generally, I think it's preferable to have a policy be more principles-based, a little bit lighter weight. And if you have, really prescriptive lists of control detail that you need to do, say like a configuration management standard or something like that, put that in a reference document like a standard or a procedure, so that you have a little more flexibility to iterate on those and change those, and you don't have to go through the whole policy acceptance workflow every time you make a change to the document. That's just like one possible idea. Really, this is up to every organization, to do what's right for them. And you frankly have a lot of flexibility to do policies that make sense for you. Now, a couple standards or, critical items. You absolutely have to do what's in your policy. So policy should not be aspirational. If you're going to any sort of audit, there's an expectation that you follow your policies. So, don't make your test harder than you need it to be, but, make it hard enough to meet your own requirements. And, as for whether or not it meets the requirements of the standard, there's not really like a silver bullet for understanding that, but you just need to understand the requirements of the standard and make sure that's reflected in the policy.
Excellent. Kind of in the realm of policies and the flexibility that an organization has, we have another question about policies. And the question is, if a customer changes their policy or processes midway through the audit window to better fit their processes and control due to changes at the company, how should that be addressed on their report, or how will that be addressed on their report?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So the policy requirements are effective for your organization when that policy is effective. So for example, you have, certain policy requirements, and then 6 months in, you change those. The expectation will be that whenever the policy was effective, you were meeting those controls. Now, how will that affect your SOC 2? And it depends, right? So the level of granularity on many SOC 2 reports is kind of high level. So you need to assess, hey, does this materially change the control language of my SOC 2 report? And sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. If it doesn't, then that's kind of okay. You just need to show that you were following your policies at when they were effective. And oh, by the way, you just need to do the thing. It's the auditor's job to audit it. So like, it's not your job to make it necessarily like super easy for them to figure that out. You just have to answer their questions and make sure that if they ask the question, you can answer it, effectively. If your controls change such that it affects your SOC 2 language, I would actually suggest that you just proactively contact your auditor. You can change your SOC 2 language, and you just have a conversation with them at the time you want to change your control, if it's mid-period, and you just work together to come up with a solution as to how this is going to affect your report and how it should be reflected in your language. And you just work, consultatively at that point with your audit partner.
Excellent. A great follow-up question based on what you just said is, what are some tips you have for choosing an audit firm?
You need to choose the audit firm that's right for you. So it depends on what your requirements are. Some companies, they have a deal on the line and it's worth a lot of money and they need a SOC 2. Well, speed to delivery is important to them. So finding an audit firm that's ready to go, can engage you, can fit you into the schedule, and who promises to deliver your report, in a timely fashion after the audit, that's super critical and important. That should be one of your criteria when you're determining who to use. For other people, it's cost. They're bootstrapping their company, they're in seed round, and they need a SOC 2, but budgets are tight, and they just need it like as affordably as they can get. That's totally fair and legitimate. We all have priorities and limited resources. Then cost is going to be one of the major drivers. There may be other companies, somebody step back. Just fit, personality. If you talk to your auditor and, let's say you schedule a call, they show up, they're super professional, they're responsive, they do a nice clean follow-up, they answer all your questions, they're easy to communicate with, they're in your same time zone, that's awesome. Another firm, you schedule a call or you reach out to them and like they don't get back to you. You ask them again and then they finally make a call and then they get on it. And the auditor seems like super distracted and disinterested. And it's just like, oh, no, you're going to sign up or not. Doesn't feel good, right? So just fit, like personality. Do you like these people? Can you work with them? Are they helpful for you? Are they meeting your needs? Like that's actually an important factor. Some organizations have a preference for like, I'm a big org. I want a big org. I want a, big branded auditor that they have a name brand, you know what I mean? That feels good to me. Some are the opposite. They're like, hey, I've worked with these big brands. That wasn't fun. I want a boutique firm that's going to just like take care of me, give me awesome customer service and be a super helpful consultative partner where I'm a bigger fish in their pond, that kind of thing. And then sort of last thing I would say would be, as your company matures or you move up market, or you're, selling to bigger and bigger enterprises, there may come a time when the brand of your auditor becomes more important to your customer. Meaning they're like, hey, this isn't a Big 4 audit or a Big 8 or like something like that. I've had these conversations actually quite a bit with some big, kind of mid-tier, high-end auditors. And I have yet to find a situation where a company was rejected because they had a SOC 2, but it didn't meet the brand requirement. The worst case scenario I've heard on that is the company won the business with the enterprise and the enterprise told them, hey, we're going to take you on now, but we want you to go up market with your auditor, in your next cycle and move to, XYZ branded auditor, an auditor that we know and trust or something like that. So, those are some various, considerations, but really, I think the important thing is get clear on what your own priorities are and then help find an auditor that's right for you. Shameless plug. We know a lot of auditors at Vanta. If you're a Vanta customer, we're certainly more than willing to give you our opinion and make multiple introductions. And, you know, we talk to a lot of auditors, and we definitely have opinions.
That's really great advice. And one thing that you touched upon that I had never thought of before was, of course, cost. If you're a small company, if you're a startup, those things are going to be really important to you. So a question that kind of ties into that is, we have a company that is deciding between SOC 2 or ISO 27001 first. So do you have any suggestions for smaller companies or startups to best navigate that decision?
Yeah, great question. I get this kind of a lot. Okay, what does your customer want? Boom, that's number one. What are they asking for? And possibly or probably, that depends a little bit on the market that you're operating in and selling to. So I would say, in general, SOC 2 is kind of it's a US based standard and probably a US based preference. So if you're operating in the US and folks are asking you for a SOC 2, which they probably are, that would be sort of the obvious choice. If you are operating internationally or in Europe, kind of everywhere else, ISO 27001 is the global standard, and that may be preferred by them. That being said, I think either standard has value in either market and can potentially help you to achieve your goals. But that's number one. What is your customer asking for? Another consideration would be, what do you do? So SOC 2 fits particularly well for technology organizations. They don't have to be. You could be a consulting firm or something like a service firm, and you can still get a SOC 2. But it fits really great if you're a SaaS company and you make a technology product. ISO 27001 is much more generic and can be much more easily applied to any type of an enterprise. So that might be another consideration, in terms of what kind of business are you in. The last point I would make would be it's like this gets back to the question of which is harder, okay? And they each have pros and cons. For SOC 2, you have your type 1 and your type 2. If you want a type 2, there is a built-in time window that you need to be operating your controls before you can go to your audit. So it's more often the case that it's going to take you longer to get there to a type 2. You can get a type 1, just like that. But if you need a type 2, it's going to take longer. Whereas type 1 or ISO, you don't have that same time requirement. You can put your controls in today and do your audit tomorrow. Okay, and the last thing I was going to say, SOC 2 is more of a controls-based audit. They look at the controls that are set in your environment, and they test that they're designed effectively and operating effectively. Designed effectively in a type 1, operating effectively in a type 2. ISO is much more of a management system. And so for ISO, there's a bunch of more prescriptive requirements around the management controls, how you set objectives, how you perform your risk assessment, doing a management review that follows some prescriptive requirements. And so, if one of those appeals to you more than another, that could be another consideration. A couple more things I'll say on this. So in SOC 2, you design your own controls. So if you know how to do that, or you're using a partner like Vanta to help you do that, that's not a big deal. If you don't know how to do that and you're just doing it on paper, that actually can be kind of a painful exercise to figure out, how do I design controls to meet the criteria? Meaning, when you just go by the SOC 2 criteria, it's pretty hard to understand if you don't have expertise in the field and just work with it. ISO, on the other hand, is off the shelf. It is a security framework. It's just much more delineated for you. You don't have to design any controls. They're already there for you to use. It's more user-friendly, I would say. And then sort of the last piece is, in the SOC 2 audit, type 2 in particular, when all of your controls are tested, all of that testing is shown on the report. And so if you didn't do a control, that is an exception on your report. And while that's not that uncommon, it's fairly common, it's you want to avoid it because it in a sense diminishes the value of your SOC 2 as a tool for selling, or complicates the process more than if you have a clean SOC 2, meaning you need a perfect test. ISO is a much more forgiving standard because if you have non-conformities in ISO, those don't get shown on your certificate. As long as they're not major nonconformities, they're minor. You still get certified. You get like a certificate, like a diploma, and you just have a little plan, a corrective action plan with your auditor on how you're going to work out those nonconformities. So if your test isn't perfect, it doesn't matter as much. So those are some various considerations to think about. I'll leave it there, Shannon.
Excellent. All right. So I think we have time for about one more question before we take that last 15 minutes to open it up to all of our guests here. So this is a great question to close out with, and I cannot wait to hear your answer. So does having ISO or SOC 2 attestations mean that our company is secure and will not be breached?
I've definitely heard this question. And I've seen it in the wild where, companies do get breached and people are like, wait, they were certified to, XYZ, like, how could that happen? So the reality is no, does not mean that you're secure and will not be breached. This is how I would think about ISO and SOC 2. ISO and SOC 2 are best practice baseline standards of control. So you're evidencing that you have a fundamental level of security maturity in order to pass one of these standards. The reality is they are not as hard or rigorous as many people might expect when they're coming into this space. And so it's essentially, if you have one of these certifications, it's showing, we do basic and fundamental security best practices. But the reality is for most security organizations, to be truly secure, you're going to have to do a number of different security controls that go over and above the requirements of these baseline standards. So while it's extremely helpful to see that a vendor has one of these things, because it shows you have a basic level of maturity, you have a basic level of seriousness and interest in your program and demonstrating your trustworthiness. You were audited by a third party, so it's not like a train wreck or completely fraudulent, all the things that you're telling me. There's a lot of value in having these certifications, and it honestly checks the box for the customer when they're putting you through their own vendor risk assessment, because it just shows these things that I just said. That being the case, it does definitely not mean that your environment is totally secure and that you can't be breached. And to the extent that you're assessing your own vendor and based on the risk of the service they're providing for you, you may have to dig deeper. You may have to ask specific questions around, how, various controls that you care about. I'll just leave it like that.
Excellent. That's incredibly helpful and a really great way to think about how these attestations can help our larger security program. So that was a fantastic answer. I personally also learned a lot. All right. Do we have any questions from our guests or participants? Or Matt, is there anything that you just think is incredibly helpful or a question that you wished somebody had asked today?
Oh, wow. Put me on the spot. Well, I'm glad that we've answered everyone's questions. What question do I wish I was asked? Let's see. What should I do if I'm, not ready to go get a certification, to help me prepare for it? I actually got this question from a small, seed startup co-founder when I was at Startup Grind the other week. And I thought it was a great question. They're like, hey, I'm not ready, but what should we be doing in the meantime? We had a detailed conversation. We walked through all of the various kind of security domains and how they apply. But if I'm going to give a high level answer to that, I would say, first off, you can always align with the framework without having to go certify. So I would certainly think it's helpful to just go, buy a copy of ISO, read through the controls, so you kind of know, this is what's going to be expected of me when I do go to get certified. Because, there's two different, sort of potentially types of companies, buckets that you can be in. Company A is already doing many of the best practice controls, typically just based on the expertise, experience, and knowledge of their team. So, let me give you just like some examples, because these are honestly like codifications of industry best practice. I'm doing background checks. I make my employees sign a confidentiality, an NDA. I do security awareness training, and they sign my policies. I didn't do that for ISO, just like, duh, that's like a smart thing to do. I do vulnerability management. I do configuration management. I control my endpoints, and I have strong anti-malware controls, hard disk encryption, et cetera. Again, not because of compliance, just because, security. I have, encryption of all my, sensitive data in transit. I require MFA everywhere. I'm, continuously monitoring my cloud configurations for drift, et cetera. And so you're just doing these security best practices. If that's the case for you, getting SOC 2 and ISO is easy. All you have to do is just kind of, spruce it up, make sure it aligns with the requirements, but you're kind of already doing the things. On the flip side, if you just haven't paid any attention to security for whatever reasons, and don't feel bad if that's you, because like they're competing priorities, and building your product or getting your business off the ground is probably priority number one. But if you just really haven't given any thought to it, and now suddenly a customer like needs you to do it, it's going to be a heavier lift. We'd never background checked anyone. We don't really have like policies. We aren't doing like vulnerability management or pen testing. Maybe we should. And I don't know, like our vendors, we pretty much use major market vendors. So like, I assume they're cool. Then you're just going to have to do more work when you're ready to go and get that certification. So there's a question I wish I was asked, Shannon. Hopefully that was interesting. I don't know if there's anything else.
That was great. Doesn't look like we have any chats coming through. So another big thank you to you, Matt Cooper. This was amazing. I'm sure we will have a lot of attendees for our next session as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And thank you to all of our attendees for asking such phenomenal questions and participating with us today.
Thanks, Shannon. That was super fun. Really, really happy to be here.
Excellent. All right. Well, we will see you all very soon. Have a great rest of the day and a wonderful week. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.